All right, let's move on to the next of the processor socket types, the land grid array, LGA. We don't have any more holes down in the socket. We don't have any more pins sticking down underneath that processor. In our newer motherboards, we're going to see a lot of the land grid array, especially the newer Intel motherboards. No pins. This processor just sort of rests down in this frame. Well, there's only one way you can put it in that frame correctly. There's some little notches on the side of the processor to make sure it goes in. And it rests down on the contacts, electrical contacts instead of holes. The Intel processors started using these. I'm going to show you a section a little bit later on the AMD processors. But right now let's talk about some of our newer Intel processors, beginning with, here's some more sockets you got to memorize, socket T, also called the LGA 775. That socket T LGA 775 was for the Pentium 4, Pentium D, Celeron D, and the Pentium Extreme Edition. Continuing with the land grid arrays came the socket H2. That's an LGA 1155. Now that's going to use the Sandy Bridge and the Ivy Bridge processors. Where in the world did we get those names? Well, Sandy Bridge actually came from Intel's Israel branch, and that was recently renamed or given the brand name of the Intel Core. The Ivy Bridge was also given the brand name Intel Core, but it's a 22 nanometer shrinking of the original Sandy Bridge. Both of those Intel Core processors fit into the LGA 1155 land grid array socket. Guess what my computer is? LGA 1155, which incidentally is not compatible with the LGA 1156 we're going to look at next. Land grid array 1155 is those Intel Core processors. There's also the LGA 1156. It's got a slightly different name. It's called the socket H or H1. Wait a minute, hold on just a second. What did I just say? The LGA 1155 is the H2, and the LGA 1156 is the H1. Go figure, all right? The socket H or the H1, the 1156 land grid array, was designed to replace the land grid array 775. It also uses the Intel Celeron, the Core i3, i5, and i7 processors. Then there's the socket B. This is a land grid array 1366. Whole boatload of pins. And this is for that Intel Core i7, the 9000 series. We're talking about a pretty significant processor here. It also is the 1366 land grid array for your Intel Xeon 35 and 3600 series, 55 and 5600 series of the Xeon, and the Intel Celeron P1053. Here's what it looks like. Here's a picture of our land grid array. On the left-hand side is the underside of that processor. Notice it's no more pins, it's just those little tiny gold contact places. But obviously you can see the notch. In the upper part of the picture, close to that corner is one notch, and opposite that, down near the bottom right, is another notch. The notches fit into that plastic carrier you see over on the right-hand side. Can't tell it too well from this photograph, but there is a notch that is closer up to the lid. In other words, closer or further up the picture, about the middle of the picture, not down at the bottom where it's kind of shiny. And that little black plastic notch is going to match up exactly to this processor. It's a real close tolerance, so it doesn't wobble around in there, because you got a lot of those gold contacts. Remember, 1155, 1156, 1366, and they make contact with the socket itself. Then, at the upper part of our picture, right up at the top, you can see what looks sort of like a lid raised up, kind of like maybe the hood of a car raised up a little bit too high. Well, that's going to come down, and it's actually going to sit on top of the chip. And then there is a locking bar that you snap into place to keep it secure. That's the land grid array chip on the left, upside down, and the land grid array socket on the right side with the lid flipped up. You're going to see that in my demo here in just a moment. All right, a little bit more about socket types. I showed you the land grid array because I had just finished talking about the Intel processors. You know, the 1155, 56, 1366. Well, let's go back to the AMD processors. AMD processors are still using pin grid array. They're not using the land grid array at this point. So with the AMD processors, you're going to see a socket 939 for the Athlon 64 and the Athlon 64FX. There's a socket 940 pin grid array for that Athlon 64FX, and that specifically is the model FX51, and Opteron for servers. Also for AMD, there is the socket which is called the AMD2. It has 940 pins. And that's going to take that single core Athlon 64, dual Athlon 64X2, Athlon 64FX, Opteron, Symptom, Phenom. But then there's also the socket AM2 Plus. That was the immediate successor to the AM2. And the AM2 Plus still also has 940 pins for pretty much the same series of processors except for one. With that AM2 Plus, we added the Phenom 2 series of processors. Then AMD has their socket AM3 and AM3 Plus. Oh goody. The AM2 and the AM2 Plus, remember, were both 940 pins. Well, these are actually a little bit different. The AM3 is 941, and the AM3 is 941, and the AM3 Plus is 942. But if you get to looking, you'll see that the processors are, again, the Phenom 2 AM3s, the Athlon 2 Semprons and Opterons for both of them. So that AM3 Plus was the successor to the original AM3 socket for the pin grid array. Still talking about AMD processors, still a socket. Now we have the FM1, which is 905 holes. This is going to take a different series of processors. There's the AMD A series, Fusion Llano processors, and those derived from Llano, including the Athlon 2. Now then, AMD does have a LAN grid array. How about that? It's the socket F, and it's got 1,207 contacts. Now it's going to be used for the Opteron 2000, 8000 series, the Athlon 64FX 7X series. That's the first of the AMD processors with the LAN grid array. Okay, we're talking about characteristics of our processor. Speeds, cores, and cache size. Speeds are measured in hertz or megahertz, and you're going to see processors running even in the gigahertz speed. Cores, your different processors could have one core or they may have more than one core. My kit processor is a quad core processor. It's the i5. The cache size and the types, well, there's going to be a whole boatload of those. There's going to be a level 1 cache. There's going to be a level 2 cache. And you might see that the level 1 cache or the level 2 cache or the level 3 caches are going to be different sizes. On my kit, I've got a 256K level 2 cache size and then 4 megabytes on the level 3 cache size. Now the speed, the cores, the quantity of cores, and the cache sizes and types vary widely across all of these processors, Intel as well as AMD. So it's not something that I want you to memorize one at a time because it would literally be dozens, even hundreds of things to memorize. But that is a clear way of making a distinction between processors. What is their speed? How many cores? Why do you care about the quantity of cores? Well, the fact of the matter is, the more that you have, 1, 2, or 4 core, a quad core system, is able to run much more efficiently with multiple programs. The cache size, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that memory that's very close to the processor, kind of like my top pocket right here, putting instructions and data into my ear, which is my brain. When we talk about memory, I'll come back to cache size a little bit more in detail. The amount of cache, the sizes that you have, again, that's going to vary widely with all the processors. So what I'd like to do is a demonstration of a couple of websites. Wikipedia's got 2 really nice websites. One is the Intel processors. It's got a nice long list from way on back up to the current stuff. And the second of the Wikipedia websites is the AMD processors. Show you a lot of information about speeds, cores, and cache size on the processors, all of which can be used to pay a little bit more money, but also to improve efficiency. So why don't we do that? Let's go take a look at those websites, and I'll show you our demonstration on speeds, cores, and cache size.